The mine was dead. That's what the men in the valley said when they looked up at the high peaks and saw no smoke, no movement, no reason to climb. The cave-in had come fast 3 weeks back, a groan, a crack, and then silence as timber and stone collapsed into the richest vein the mountain had ever shown. The ore carts sat frozen in place. The tools hung on their pegs. The tunnel mouth gaped open like a wound that had stopped bleeding but would never heal. Calder Boone stood at the entrance every morning, staring at the wall of rubble that blocked his future. The air up here cut differently than it did below the timberline. Thinner. Colder. Mistakes didn't fade, they stayed visible, like scars on exposed rock. Winter was 14 days out, maybe less if the clouds kept building over the western ridge. When the snow came heavy, the passes would close. No supply wagons. No buyers. No way down until spring thaw. The mountain would make its own decisions then, and men would have to live with them. The debt sat in a leather folder on the cabin table, each page a countdown. Supply house, 3 months overdue. Mule handler, 2. The bank in town, a sum that grew every week like ice forming on a bucket. Calder had stopped opening the folder after the first week. The numbers didn't change by being ignored, but they didn't get worse when he wasn't looking at them either. Rufus Klein knew the numbers without seeing them. Klein was the kind of man who could smell weakness from a different mountain. He'd ridden up twice since the collapse, sitting easy in his saddle, offering to buy the land for what he called a fair price. It wasn't fair. It barely covered the timber alone. But Klein wasn't in a hurry. He had time. He had money. He had patience. His offer would stand until the first heavy snow. After that, he'd just wait. The mine would freeze. The debts would compound. By spring, he could take the land for nothing and Calder would be gone, another name the valley forgot before summer. The marriage came together with the same stripped-down logic as ordering lamp oil or counting nails. No sentiment. No promises that couldn't be kept. Mara Holt's name came through a boarding house keeper in the valley town who knew women who needed shelter and men who needed help. The terms were simple, a roof for the winter, shared labor, shared provisions. She would cook, mend, and keep the cabin functional. He would provide safety, food, and a legal arrangement that kept questions away. No talk of affection. No lies about what came after the snow melted. She arrived before the sun broke over the east ridge, frost silvering the shoulders of her coat. Calder saw the trunk first, heavy, reinforced at the corners with iron binding that looked like it had traveled far and hard. It took both of them to lift it from the mule's pack frame. She didn't apologize for the weight. She didn't explain it either. Mara Holt was lean, wind-worn, somewhere past 30. Her hands were work-scarred. Her eyes moved constantly, taking in the cabin, the mine entrance, the tree line, the sky. She spoke when spoken to and not much otherwise. She unpacked carefully, setting things in order without asking where they should go. By nightfall, the cabin smelled like coffee and firewood instead of just cold stone and desperation. Calder watched her move through the space and realized he knew nothing about her except that she'd agreed to come. No family names mentioned. No town of origin beyond the valley. Just a woman with a heavy trunk and winter closing in, same as him. The mountain didn't care about the reasons. It only cared about what happened next. The cabin found its rhythm in the first 3 days. Calder woke before light, same as he always had, and dressed in the dark while frost patterns crawled across the inside of the window glass. He'd check the supports near the mine entrance, walk the perimeter of the collapse, and return with nothing changed. The rubble sat exactly as it had the day before. Solid. Immovable. Final. Mara rose when he left and had the fire rebuilt by the time he returned. She worked without excess motion, efficient, deliberate, like someone who'd learned not to waste effort. The water bucket was always full. The tools were cleaned and stored. The shelves stayed organized. She didn't ask about the mine. She didn't comment on his long silences or the way he sometimes stood at the window staring at nothing. The first week passed. Then the second. The temperature dropped at night and stayed low through the morning. The mule handler came up the trail once, looking grim, and told Calder the first snow had already hit the high pass to the north. Another week, maybe 10 days, and the road would be impassable. He didn't ask about payment. He just looked at the idle or carts and left. Calder spread the mine maps across the table one evening after supper. The lamplight threw shadows across the pencil lines and elevation marks. He traced the main tunnel with one finger, following it to where the collapse blocked everything. There was a lower seam, smaller, uncertain, possibly played out, that branched off before the cave-in. It was a fool's hope. The kind of desperate move that wasted time and energy and usually ended with nothing but more debt and broken tools. He felt Mara behind him before he heard her. She'd moved to stand at his shoulder, close enough to see the map clearly. Her presence was quiet but focused. Calder explained without looking up, more to himself than to her, that the lower seam might hold something. Probably wouldn't. But it was the only option that didn't involve walking away or waiting for Klene to take everything. Her finger came down on the map. Not on the lower seam. On the collapse itself. She traced the blocked section once. Then again. Her touch was deliberate, following the shape of the cave-in as Calder had drawn it. She didn't speak. She just studied the lines, the measurements, the angles of the tunnel where it met the collapse. Calder watched her hand move and felt something shift in the room, some assumption he'd been carrying that no longer fit quite right. When she stepped back, she didn't explain. She just returned to the corner where her trunk sat against the wall. That night, after Calder had banked the fire and settled into the rough cot on the far side of the room, he heard the trunk open. The hinges made a low creak. There was the sound of objects being moved, metal on metal, the rustle of cloth, the soft thump of something heavy being set on the floor. He didn't turn to look. The cabin was small enough that privacy was a thing you created by choosing not to watch, not by walls or distance. But he saw the lamplight shift. Saw her shadow move across the ceiling beams as she knelt beside the trunk. Saw the outline of her shoulders as she bent over something he couldn't identify from across the room. The lamp stayed lit longer than usual that night. When it finally went dark, Calder lay awake in the silence, listening to the wind test the cabin walls and wondering what exactly he'd agreed to when Mara Holt had arrived with her iron-bound trunk and her careful, watchful eyes. The mountain groaned once in the deep cold. Timber settling. Stone contracting. The sound of winter preparing to lock everything in place. Morning came pale and cold. Mara was already dressed when Calder woke, standing near the table with the lamp burning low. The trunk sat open behind her. On the table lay coils of braided wire, leather-wrapped tools he didn't recognize, and a brass timing device scratched and dented with age. Next to them sat a ledger, its pages dense with measurements and diagrams written in a hand too precise to be casual notes. She didn't wait for him to ask. She said her father had trained demolition crews during the war. Bridge work mostly. Sometimes rail lines. The kind of work where too much force brought everything down and too little changed nothing. He'd taught her to read stone the way other men read soil or sky. Taught her the difference between breaking something and breaking it clean. Calder stared at the tools spread across his table. The wire looked military grade. The timing device had markings he'd seen once on equipment the army used for field engineering. The ledger fell open to a page showing a bridge support with calculations running down the margin in tight, controlled script. She closed the ledger and met his eyes. She said the collapse could be opened. Not with shovels. Not with brute digging. That would bring the rest of the tunnel down and bury anyone inside for good. But if the weak points were found and stressed correctly, the rubble could be made to shift inward instead of outward. It could be peeled back instead of shattered. Calder asked how she knew it would work. She said she didn't. Not for certain. But she knew what wouldn't work, and everything he'd been planning fell into that category. They climbed to the mine entrance as the sun broke over the ridge. The air was sharp enough to burn in the lungs. Inside the tunnel, their breath plumed white in the lamplight. The collapse sat 30 yards in, a wall of compacted shale and fractured quartz wedged tight against a bowed support beam. Calder had stared at it so many times the shape was burned into his memory. A monument to failure. Mara approached it differently. She moved slowly, methodically, tapping the rock face with a small hammer and listening to the sound it made. High and bright in some places. Dull and thick in others. She marked the spots with chalk, thin lines that meant something to her and nothing to Calder yet. She pulled a strip of cloth from her pocket and held it near the edges of the collapse, watching how it moved in the faint draft that leaked through gaps in the rubble. Air flow meant space behind the wall. Space meant the collapse wasn't solid all the way through. It had structure. Weak points. Places where pressure had built unevenly. Calder watched her work and realized she was reading the cave-in the way he read or veins, seeing patterns invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She stepped back and pointed to 3 locations on the rock face. She said those were the pressure points. If they drilled there and placed charges exactly right, small, controlled, timed in sequence, the collapse would fold inward along its own fracture lines. The tunnel wouldn't cave further. It would open. Calder asked what happened if she was wrong. She said they'd die quickly, which was better than freezing slowly over the winter or handing everything to Klene. It wasn't comfortable. It was honesty. Calder respected that more than reassurance. He asked if she'd done this before. She said no. Her father had. She'd only ever assisted. But she'd watched him clear 12 bridge footings and a collapsed rail tunnel without losing a single man, and she'd kept every page of notes he'd ever written. The lamp flickered between them. The tunnel waited. Winter pressed closer with every hour. Calder nodded once. They will begin drilling at first light tomorrow. They worked in secret. Klene's men were known to watch the high trails, and word moved fast in the thin air where sound carried farther than it should. Calder told the mule handler they were clearing debris from the lower seam, nothing worth mentioning, just keeping busy through the cold. The handler nodded and didn't ask questions. Men up here learned not to. The drilling started slowly. Calder worked the hand auger while Mara marked depth with chalk on the bit. Each hole had to be exact, too shallow and the charge would waste itself against surface rock, too deep and the pressure would disperse into empty space behind the collapse. She checked every measurement twice, sometimes 3 times, her fingers tracing the chalk marks while her lips moved through calculations only she could see. The work was brutal. The auger bit into fractured quartz that wanted to shatter rather than drill clean. Calder's shoulders burned. His hands split open across the palms where old calluses tore and new ones hadn't formed yet. Mara wrapped them with cloth strips soaked in whiskey. The sting was sharp and immediate, but the bleeding stopped. They drilled 3 holes the first day. For the second. By the third day, Calder's arms shook so badly he had to stop every 20 minutes to let the muscle cramps pass. Mara took over when he couldn't continue, her frame smaller but her motion steady, leveraging body weight instead of fighting the stone with strength alone. At night they reinforced the tunnel walls. The old upper drift had been abandoned 2 seasons back, its timber still sound enough to salvage. They hauled beams down in the dark, working by lamplight, fitting them into place along the sidewalls where the collapse met solid rock. The supports had to hold if the rubble shifted. One failure and the entire tunnel would accordion inward. Snow flurried on the 4th day. Light, scattered, gone by noon. But the temperature didn't rise afterward. The sky stayed low and gray. The wind shifted to come from the north. Calder had seen this pattern before. It meant the real storm was gathering somewhere beyond the peaks, building strength, waiting for the right moment to break. Mara cut the charges in the cabin after dark, measuring powder onto small squares of waxed paper and folding them with the care of someone stitching a wound. She used her father's brass scale, adjusting grain by grain until the weight matched the numbers in her ledger. Too much and the stone would fracture chaotically. Too little and nothing would move at all. She wrapped each charge in oilcloth, tied them with wire, and marked them with numbers that corresponded to the holes they drilled. Calder watched her hands move, precise, unhurried, confident. She had the look of someone performing a task she'd seen done correctly so many times that error felt impossible. But he'd seen that look before on men who'd miscalculated a tunnel support or misjudged a vein's stability. Confidence didn't stop cave-ins. It just made them more surprised. He asked how she knew the sequence. She opened the ledger and showed him the diagram her father had drawn for a collapsed rail tunnel in Tennessee. The geology was different, but the principle was the same: fracture lines followed pressure, and pressure followed the path of least resistance. You didn't fight the stone. You convinced it to move where it already wanted to go. Calder looked at the charges lined up on the table. 12 of them. Small, precise, wrapped tight. They looked harmless. Like something a child might mistake for candy. Mara said they'd set them at dawn. The cold would keep the powder stable. The timing would give them 30 seconds to reach cover before the first charge fired. 30 seconds. The length of a long breath. The distance between standing and buried. They didn't sleep. The cabin stayed quiet through the night, both of them lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind work at the roof boards. Calder watched the shadows shift across the ceiling beams and thought about all the ways stone could fall. Fast, slow, sideways, straight down. He'd seen men pulled from collapses with their bones turned to powder inside skin that looked untouched. He'd seen tunnels fold so cleanly it looked like they'd never existed at all. Mara rose an hour before dawn and made coffee strong enough to taste like punishment. They drank it without speaking. She packed the charges into a canvas satchel, checking each one against her list. Calder collected the tamping rods, the fuse line, and the timing device. The brass casing felt heavier than it should in his hand. The climb to the mine entrance was dark and cold. Stars still showed overhead, sharp and distant. Their breath crystallized in the air. The tunnel swallowed them whole, lamplight pushing back the darkness just far enough to see the next 10 feet of ground. At the collapse, Mara worked quickly. She placed each charge into its drilled hole, tamping them firm with clay and rock dust, packing the space tight so the force would push inward rather than vent back out the hole. She strung the fuse line with her father's wire, connecting each charge in the sequence she'd mapped. First the bottom corner where the weight was greatest. Then the two side points where the fracture lines converged. Then the upper section where the beam had bowed. Calder held the lamp and watched her hands move. Steady. Certain. No hesitation. She tied off the last connection and ran the main fuse line back toward the tunnel entrance, playing out wire as she walked. 50 feet. 70. 100. She stopped at the turn where the tunnel angled and solid rock stood between them and the blast. They packed tamping earth against the wall, sandbags they'd filled the night before, stacked tight to absorb the shock wave. Mara checked the fuse line one final time, tracing it back with her eyes to where it disappeared around the corner. She looked at Calder. He nodded. She set the timing device, wound the mechanism, and locked it into place. The brass gears ticked. Soft. Steady. Counting down. They moved behind the sandbags and crouched low. Calder's heart hammered against his ribs. The lamp sat between them, flame steady in the still air. The ticking continued. 20 seconds. 15. 10. Mara pressed her hands over her ears. Calder did the same. The blast came at noon exactly, though neither of them knew it at the time. The sound was not thunder. Not an explosion. It was something deeper, a heavy exhalation, like the mountain releasing breath it had been holding since the first collapse. The ground shuddered. Dust rolled down the tunnel in a thick wave, blotting out the lamplight. The air turned gray and choked. They stayed down. Waited. The dust began to settle, drifting like snow in the dim glow of the lamp. The sound faded into silence broken only by the soft patter of loose rock finding the ground. Calder stood first. His ears rang. His chest felt compressed, like something had reached inside and squeezed. Mara rose beside him, coughing into her sleeve. They picked up the lamp and moved forward slowly, watching the ground for fresh cracks, listening for the groan of timber about to fail. The collapse came into view through the thinning dust. It had moved. Not outward. Not down. Inward. The rubble had slumped away from the tunnel walls, folding into itself along the fracture lines exactly as Mara had drawn them. Beyond the shifted stone, in the space that had been sealed for weeks, the vein showed dark and clean. Silver threaded through the rock like veins of frost on winter glass. They didn't celebrate. There was no time for it and no energy left to spend on anything that didn't work. Calder moved forward first, testing each step before putting weight on it. The floor was littered with debris, fractured shale, rock dust, splinters of timber from the original collapse. The air smelled like sulfur and crushed stone. The vein ran deeper than the maps had shown. High-grade ore, dense and heavy when Calder chipped a sample free and weighed it in his palm. The kind of silver that made men rich or got them killed, depending on who knew about it first. He looked back at Mara. She stood at the edge of the cleared space, lamp raised, studying the ceiling where fresh cracks had appeared in the rock overhead. She pointed to 3 spots where the stone had shifted during the blast. Stress fractures, thin but growing. They'd need support before any real work could start. Calder nodded and they retreated to gather timber. The next days blurred together. They shored the ceiling with salvaged beams, bracing them against the tunnel walls at angles Mara calculated from her father's notes. They cleared rubble until their backs screamed and their hands bled through the wrappings. The ore came out in pieces at first, chunks Calder could carry in a canvas sack. Then larger sections that required the ore cart and both of them pushing to move it toward the entrance. Mara kept the charges exact. There were pockets of compressed shale deeper in the vein that needed to be broken carefully or risk another collapse. She placed small charges, lit them, and they'd retreat to cover while the mountain coughed out another section of stone. Each blast was surgical. Precise. Nothing wasted. They slept in shifts. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. One of them always worked while the other rested. Calder would wake to find fresh or loaded in the cart, ready to haul. Mara would rise to discover new support beams already in place. The tunnel extended another few feet into the vein. Their hands split and healed and split again. Calder's knuckles stayed raw. Mara's fingers developed calluses on top of calluses. They stopped noticing. Pain became part of the work, same as cold or exhaustion or the constant taste of rock dust in the back of the throat. The mule trail iced over on the 8th day. Calder made the descent anyway, leading the mule with its panniers loaded heavily. The ore crates reached the scale house in town by midday. The assayer weighed them, tested the samples, and didn't hide his surprise. He asked where Calder had found ore this clean. Calder said the lower seam had finally paid off. The assayer didn't believe him, but he paid in full and asked when the next load would arrive. 2 days later, Calder made the climb again. More crates. More silver. The debts began to shrink. First the mule handler, paid in full with a bonus for the risk of the icy trail. Then the supply house, their ledger stamped clear. Then the bank, where the clerk's expression shifted from skepticism to something close to respect when Calder counted out the payment and asked for a receipt. Rufus Klein arrived on the 10th day, his horse struggling up the frozen trail. He found Calder at the mine entrance, loading another cart. Klein sat his saddle and stared at the ore, at the reopened tunnel, at the fresh timber supports visible in the lamplight beyond. His face went hard. He asked how much Calder wanted for the claim now. Calder said it wasn't for sale. Klein's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. He said the offer wouldn't come again. Calder said that was fine. He had everything he needed right here. Klein turned his horse and rode back down the mountain without another word. The blizzard came that night. No warning beyond a sudden drop in temperature and the way the wind changed direction, swinging hard from the northwest. Calder had just returned from town with the final load, the mule stumbling on ice, both of them moving through darkness that felt solid. He reached the cabin as the first heavy flakes began to fall. Mara met him at the door. She took the mule's lead and helped him unload the supplies, flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee. Enough to see them through until spring if they were careful. The last crate of ore sat in the scale house in town, stamped and logged. The final payment had cleared the bank's ledger completely. The mine was legally theirs, free and clear, posted with Calder's name on the claim register where anyone could see it. By midnight, the snow had buried the trail. By dawn, the pass was gone entirely, erased under white that stretched unbroken toward the valley below. The wind howled against the cabin walls, testing every joint and seam. Inside, the fire burned steadily. The shelves were stocked. The roof held. Calder stood at the window and watched the storm remake the landscape. The mine entrance had disappeared under a drift. The ore carts were buried. Even the tree line was hard to see through the horizontal snow. The mountain had made its decision. They were locked in now until the thaw, same as he'd known they would be. But this time, the winter didn't feel like a trap. It felt like earned rest. Mara moved through the cabin with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown since arriving. But something had shifted in the way she carried herself. Less watchful. Less guarded. She didn't flinch when Calder moved near her to reach the coffee pot. She didn't track his movements across the room the way she had those first weeks. The constant vigilance had eased into something closer to comfort. They settled into a rhythm different from before. Calder maintained the tools, sharpened blades, repaired harness leather. Mara organized the supplies, rotated stores, and kept the ledgers updated with every expense and payment. When the wind died enough to venture out, they checked the mine entrance together, clearing snow from the supports, making sure the tunnel hadn't taken water that would freeze and crack the timber. The work was lighter now. Necessary but not desperate. They could afford to rest when tired. Could afford to sit by the fire in the evening without the weight of unpaid debts pressing down like stone overhead. One night, Mara opened her father's ledger and began copying sections into a new book, clean pages, careful script, diagrams redrawn with precision. She said the old book was falling apart. The binding had cracked. Pages were coming loose. She wanted the knowledge preserved before it was lost. Calder watched her work and asked if she'd ever wanted to do the demolition work herself. Not just assist. Not just calculate and prepare. Actually set the charges and clear the collapses on her own. She paused, pen hovering over the page. She said her father had wanted to teach her completely. Had planned to, before the fever took him. But the war had ended and the demolition crews disbanded, and no mining outfit would hire a woman for blasting work no matter how much she knew. So she'd kept the tools, kept the knowledge, and waited for a situation desperate enough that competence mattered more than convention. Calder asked if this had been that situation. She said yes. He asked if she'd do it again. She looked at him directly, her expression unreadable in the firelight. She said that depended on whether the partnership still held when the snow melted. He said it did. On his end, anyway. She nodded once and returned to her copying. Outside, the storm continued its work, piling snow higher, sealing them away from everything except each other and the mountain and the mine that had nearly killed them both. The storms came in waves through January. 3 days of clear cold, then another blizzard that buried the cabin to the window sills. They dug out, stocked the fire, and waited for the next one. The mine rested under 20 feet of snow, the entrance sealed completely. There was no point trying to reach it. The mountain had claimed it back for the season, and come spring they'd reclaim it in return. February brought longer stretches of calm. The sun appeared more often, brilliant against the white expanse, hard enough to hurt the eyes. Calder and Mara ventured farther from the cabin, checking the timber supports on the exterior walls, ensuring the roof vents stayed clear. The cold was sharp but clean. The kind that clarified thought rather than dulled it. They spoke more as the winter deepened. Not about the past, neither of them carried much interest in what had already happened. But about the mine, about what spring would bring, about how to expand the operation without overreaching. Mara suggested they bring in 1 or 2 trusted men when the passes opened. Calder agreed. The vein ran deep enough that 2 people couldn't work it efficiently alone. She asked what he'd do if the silver played out. He said he'd look for copper or find another vein. The mountain held more than one fortune if a man knew where to look and didn't mind the work. She said that was a reasonable answer. He asked what she'd do if she had her choice of anything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd like to teach someone what her father had taught her. Pass the knowledge forward before it disappears completely. Calder said she could do that here. If they brought in men, she could train them properly. Show them how to read stone, how to set charges that open rock instead of shattering it. Most miners learned by watching other miners who'd learned by watching mistakes get made. She could break that pattern. Mara considered this. She said it would require the men to listen. To trust her judgment even when it contradicted their assumptions. Calder said any man too proud to learn from someone who knew more than him wasn't worth hiring anyway. She smiled. It was brief, barely there, but Calder saw it. The first real smile since she'd arrived with her iron-bound trunk and her careful silence. March brought the first thaw. Water ran off the roof in steady streams. The snow-pack settled and compacted. The trail remained impassable, but the direction was clear now. Winter was releasing its grip. The mountain was preparing to let them back in. They inspected the mine entrance as soon as the snow cleared enough. The supporters had held. The tunnel showed no fresh damage. Inside, beyond the reach of weather, the vein waited exactly as they'd left it. Dark stone threaded with silver, patient and indifferent to the passage of time. Calder stood at the tunnel mouth and looked back at Mara. She had her father's ledger tucked under one arm, a lamp in her other hand. Her coat was patched but clean. Her face was weathered but steady. She'd arrived as a stranger, a necessity, a solution to a problem that had nothing to do with partnership or trust. But the winter had changed that. The work had changed it. The mine had demanded they be more than 2 people sharing space. It had required precision, mutual dependence, respect earned through competence rather than given through obligation. The marriage remained what it had become under stone and timber. Not a romance. Not a convenience. Something more durable than either. A partnership built on work done right, on silence kept when it mattered, on strength measured in precision rather than pride. Spring would bring new challenges. The vein would need working. Men would need hiring and training. The operation would grow or it wouldn't, depending on choices they'd make together. But for now, the mine was theirs. The mountain had tested them and they'd answered correctly. That was enough. If you enjoyed this story of survival and partnership in the Wild West, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales from the frontier. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Calder and Mara's journey. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.